Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to have this opportunity to share my research and ideas with you at this important conference. And it was more than 10 years ago that I conceptualized the notion of transnational identity capital in relation to my research on transnational mobile academics and internationalization. And internationalization has been a dominant global imperative for universities and academics to brand and circulate themselves. And it is complex assemblage of values linked not only to economic growth, but also to soft power and intercultural competences. So my conference paper abstract, which you may have read through the online, was actually written long before the pandemic lockdown. So I had to rethink the conference theme on the whole. So my talk will introduce the shifting paradigm and new gestalt for internationalization to explain transnational identity capital and its role in knowledge creation as outlined here. So I will talk about internationalization as a higher education policy, discourse and practice, old and new. And then I will talk about the shifting paradigm and new gestalt for internationalization to explain what I mean by transnational identity capital and the role of transnational identity capital in knowledge creation, and also for the professionalization of strangerhood and internationalization at home. So internationalization as higher education policy, discourses and practices is built on trans-border assumptions, i.e. mobility, and international relations. In the old paradigm, mobility has been valorized as a structural necessity, an integral part of normative justification of internationalization. The number of international students in higher education, those studying outside of their home countries, has continued to increase exponentially, which is estimated at over 5 million, to realize the globalization of academic mobility. And higher education internationalization and academic mobility in history can be explained in line with the empires and wars, because a lot of the international wars, as a result, saw the mobility of academics and intellectuals and many other enforced mobilities, and the massification of higher education over the last 50 years or so, and then neoliberal marketization of higher education, which about which I will talk more in detail later. And the first 2 decades of the 21st century saw a new phase of internationalization in higher education with increased global traffic of academic mobility and migration before the pandemic outbreak, of course. And yet, through the resurgence of ethno-nationalism, a strong backlash against migration worldwide, and in the UK and the US, such ethno-nationalist backlash was notably triggered by Brexit and Trump, and most recently by the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. A priori ground for what we mean by internationalization seemed to become obsolete in the ongoing pandemic as mobility. And one of the key elements of internationalization has become severely restricted. And how can we then make sense of this analytically and comparatively? And I attempt to explain higher education internationalization through 3 ways to look at international relations. as listed here, invoking Martin Weiss, the English School of International Relations Theory, and I adapted this international relations theory for the purpose of my analysis of internationalization. First, effective normative justification for higher education, internationalization in the world society that is often linked to intercultural discourse. It is a Kantian revolutionist goal of perpetual peace. And second, I think that there is a rational political economic justification for higher education internationalization in the international society. The diffusion of internationalization policies and practices are often explained as isomorphic by neo-institutionalists, such as excellence initiatives implemented in many countries across the globe. And this approach can be linked to Gaussian rationalist approach to international relations. And thirdly, competition and stratification in the international system. The system is run by zero-sum games in the international higher education market. And this reflects Hobbesian realism. And against the conceptual apparatus of international relations, my initial basic assumptions and arguments are sketched here. First, international relations are embedded in our worldview and scholarship. And second, international relations and intercultural norms set the boundaries and create biases and margins. And third, the types of knowledge carried produced by academics are a combination of Wissenschaften and Weltanschauungen. And I'm then wondering if new knowledge creation is in a means or an end goal of internationalization. To understand how knowledge is transformed into capital, it is important to understand the relations of positional knowledge and creative knowledge generated by individual academics in the contemporary university, leading to innovation.
We can see it this way as well. If this is better for you, we can see it this way as well.
Yes, this may be helpful. So at the higher education policy level, excellence initiatives have been launched at both supranational and national levels in Europe and Asia under significantly different frames and contexts as listed here. Obviously, the excellence initiatives at both supranational and national levels in Europe are different from the excellence initiatives developed in East Asia. And in the UK, after Brexit, the government launched the Global Talent Research Fund to attract global talents to the UK, not only from the developed countries, but also the new developing countries to the UK after the so-called Brexiters, the European the talents are leaving the UK. So there are different policy strategies competing between regions and individual countries, competing to make new centers of excellence and higher education hubs, and then different individual career strategies and the modes of knowledge production and stratification can be configured. This is an excerpt from the interview with an eminent Australian male professor working in the UK who was one of the 60 interviews I conducted over the years. And he explained the reason for his move to the UK. I had been on the top of the field in Australia for more than a decade, but I needed to move out of my comfort zone. Most of my ideas and best work were overseas oriented already, though I could have kept working globally from Australia. A large part of intellectual life in many countries is now carried by non-nationals and cross-border collaborations. Regarding his positionality, he frankly says that I always feel foreign here, and to some extent also Australian, in a way I did not feel in Australia, as Australia is firmly positioned here in terms of the colonial Britain-Australia relationship. This kind of Australianness is personally like discrimination on the basis of color. It is not an identity that I choose. The colonial relationship is painful for me to the point where I find myself stereotyping the English in response. I will never feel comfortable in the UK. So the pattern of cross-border international academic mobility are closely entwined with the mode of international relations. And the contemporary international political economy, in part, is no longer neoliberal, but mercantilist, I think. And how do we read the contemporary world? Is it surveilled, quantified, stratified world? And the pandemic crisis amplified the fragility of global value chains affecting transnational mobility migration, with a major economic, socio-political impacts on higher education businesses and internationalization policy and practices. And this is an excerpt from the public philosopher Roman Krznaric. He rightly said the globalization of the neoliberal market paradigm so far has been neglecting social, cultural, traditional, and ecological considerations. And we have colonized the future. We treat it like a distant colonial outpost where we can freely dump ecological damage and technological risk, and which we can plunder as we please. Overall, there are sustainability issues in the old paradigm. The ongoing pandemic is speeding up political, social, economic, and technological changes, and higher education is no exception. The ecology and the gestalt of higher education is rapidly changing and normalizing the new platform economy based on big data, digital network, and AI, and in which mutuality, affect, and empathy would become more important principles of economic value creation. In the UK and Australia, the disintegration of university budgets and contraction of universities and collapse of new hubs have been quite notable during this pandemic period. And as triggered by this pandemic immobility, are we seeing the early end of Erasmus and decline of the mobile staff? So we need to think about these implications for higher education internationalization, and a new policy and practice is obviously required. I think we are at a new turning point for the great transformation of higher education and the meaning of internationalization, and a new gestalt for internationalization is emerging by the changing means of value creation. The meaning of internationalization at home also needs to be rethought, which can be literally mean at home in the pandemic. My new PhD student at the UCL, University College London, has never left her home country, Korea, as she has decided to do her PhD from her home in Korea in this academic year. An isolated way of life has become the new normal since lockdowns for some, but for some people since even before the COVID-19 hit. In fact, there is even a word for it, untapped. It's a Korean English word meaning a non-contact, a combination of the prefix on and the word untapped. So they made it a kind of Konglish untapped, but it's been a very widely popularly used in Korea marketing circles since 2017. And during doing things without direct contact with others, such as using self-service kiosk and shopping online or making contactless payments, has become new normal. And untapped is a way of doing things without direct contact with others. And in marketing strategies, technologies, or industries that require no personal contact to execute. And I think higher education is no exception. The pandemic is accelerating transformation of higher education. The untapped future will be much more than online shopping, obviously. And it is about the equal and open distribution of information and knowledge and the ability to stay connected to health and social services. An untapped modality should not mean leaving behind the vulnerable in society. And I use this picture of a Holy Communion in a pandemic style to think about the new digital ecology of higher education, internationalization. Transubstantiation of bread and wine in the Holy Communion is through the efficacy of the word of Christ and by the action of the Holy Spirit. And analogically, we can imagine the epistemic and pedagogic transubstantiation taking place in higher education space, as in the Holy Communion. And becoming a transnational academic is like assuming strangerhood, and practices of academic mobility and displacement could reconstitute identifications in relation to home and elsewhere. This geographical border transcending positioning becomes a vantage point to make some knowledge claims. So in my research over the 12 years, I examined the particular relations of academic intellectuals, mobility and knowledge by employing the concept of transnational identity capital. Identity capital as a term was originally coined by Cote and Levin, which they defines as operating to gain a group membership validation or preserving a self-definition. And they say identity capital is differentiated from social capital. This in general refers to bonding and network power. And exposure to new contexts can help to develop a comparative base and generate new knowledge through the development of transnational identity capital, which involves a generic, reflexive, and cosmopolitan competences to engage with otherness. I mean, not just the identity capital, but when we say transnational, I think the gaining the group validation, group membership validation, and preserving the self-identity is exposed to a new challenge, more complex, the Gestalt. So hence, transnational identity capital as a concept is not a context, a particular context. It's not context specific or class specific. It is a critical reflexive axis, an authentic individual asset, not reproducible. It is a tacit embodied knowledge capital. It represents attributes associated with a set of personal psychological competencies in negotiating their ways in the transnational space especially in the absence of tangible cultural guidance and social norms. It enables mobility in and out of different habitats between and above international territorial boundaries. It is enhanced by symbolic capital, objectified, institutionalized capital, but it is certainly not the same as a cultural capital or social capital. And Zimmel sociology, I mean, by the time you probably have thought that Georg Zimmel's famous sociology of stranger, which invokes the important concept and values as a social distance, the marginal man, cosmopolites, and objectivity in academic research, and to a certain extent, interculturality. And a stranger cannot become a full member of a group given that condition of her objectivity and her lack of ownership and her own sense of strangeness. While Zimmel's stranger does not aspire to belong to the locals, Alfred Schut's stranger, his concept of stranger seeks inclusion in the group. And while the locals need Zimmel's stranger to settle their conflicts, Schut's stranger poses a threat to the locals. So there is a kind of different conceptualization of the role and positionality of the stranger by Georg Zimmel and Alfred Schutz. And analogically, transnational mobile academics, I think, can be inferred here, whose position is conditioned not only by spatial relations on the one hand, but also assumed by their epistemic modality and or symbol of human relations on the other. And in hindsight, I judge that my own comparative research inquiries have been affected by crossing international territorial boundaries and moved along with my changing positions and experiences as a stranger as my migration experience deepens. I'm originally from Seoul, Korea, South Korea, and moved to London for my postgraduate studies. And as introduced earlier before my talk, I have worked in London and Paris and also Seoul. And through the Erasmus program, I have worked in various different universities in Europe. And overall, I have been living in the UK and Europe for the last 27 years. So the ability to move between social groups, including international boundaries, is a definitional disposition for strangers with a transnational identity capital. And the freedom then follows from the position of objectivity as identified by Georg Zimmel to see one's position from a bird's eye view. And transnational identity capital as embodied and traveled knowledge then raises some fundamental issues around positional knowledge and creative knowledge generated by individual mobile academic individuals, and their relations in the contemporary neoliberal interface between internationalization and EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusion policy. The barriers of ethnicity, nationality, race, gender, religion, and culture, and the boundaries for internationalization alter as they move. And I project two gestalt to think about the relations of identity and knowledge creation. The first, the Western educated, industrial, rich, and democratic society, which was termed as, using the acronym WEIRD. This society saw the institutionalization of strangerhood. And universities has now the EDI policy instated. I mean, almost all universities have this EDI policy, which led to the popularity of identity politics on campus. And identity politics has become a basis of a normative research industry nowadays. And there is a danger of doing self-sustaining advocacy research, as Rachel has warned. There is a danger of a sanctification of victimization among third world minority intellectuals, that's what she said, who are based in the Western academy. This is the second gestalt I projected here. What is narrated as the global South categorically is more often legitimated by the first word-based authors. And Rachel suggests that as long as the third world intellectuals or minority diasporas remain within the boundary of exotica of victims, the first word scholars will continue to enjoy the unconscious ethnocentrism that remain intact in this rhetoric of exaggeration and simplification of victimization. And contemporaneously, the BLM, the Black Lives Matter, or in the UK, the BME, the Black and Minority Ethnic, the acronym, and EDI, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, policy and practices have become a prerequisite for the institutionalization of strangerhood in UK higher education, for instance. However, most East Asian academics whom I have encountered and or interviewed for my research on transnational identity capital prefer to be recognized as an individual outlier rather than as a victim or a model minority categorized in racial ethnic terms. And they do not participate in identity politics based on their racial ethnic background. Not least because of my own Korean ethnic national cultural background, broadly categorized as an East Asian. But given the commonalities that I have come across among the international East Asian academics in the UK and Europe, my research investigated international East Asian academics' positional identities against the prototype of transnational identity capital I have conceptualized. And my research findings illuminate a complex geography of race and ethnicity and the conventions of internationalization and EDI policy discourses and boundaries in higher education. And regarding strangerhood, this interviewee does not acknowledge her experience of bullying in her previous university can be related to racism, saying such attributions simplifies a complex situation. Also saying, I don't really define myself in racial ethnic terms. And on knowledge creation, this interviewee, who has worked in Australia, Canada, Norway, USA, and the UK, confirms that her marginal background has been helpful in assisting me to see other perspectives more readily, and therefore to more readily question established or taken for granted viewpoints, including my own as well. In that sense, I think having a marginal background has made me more critical and able to appropriate the influence of dominant thinking. And on the interface between internationalization and EDI, she said, I feel foreign again now, in a way, as I try to champion issues of internationalization, equality, and diversity at my university. But I have little official role or authority despite my own background and academic expertise in this matter. I feel like I am still trying to do things unofficially and from the margins, which in some ways is how people from marginal backgrounds have to operate to get what they want done. From my experience in the UK, I would say that there is not enough systematic harnessing of this experience, and I suspect that much of this happens informally on the initiative of the foreign academics themselves. And another international East Asian female academic, originally from Japan, answers my question if foreign academics can make distinctive contribution to the internationalization of universities and new knowledge creation by saying, yes, but as far as these do not challenge existing values of universities, which are often embedded in Eurocentric knowledge production. And another East Asian female academic strongly defines her position. I like the freedom to define myself. I don't need to play the game. I believe in meritocracy. There are just individual attributes, individual choices, and individual disadvantages. This is, I think, a powerful statement against the current dominant discourses around identity politics in higher education and society in general. Overall, having interviewed 17 international East Asian academics in the UK who have worked in more than 2 countries in their academic career, I find the following commonalities. They have a pride, no stigma in their ethnic, national, cultural, civilizational entities, and strong belief in meritocracy, strong resilience and flexibility in pursuing academic careers in the UK as well as internationally, and strong individuality in their institutions. Most of them have not joined the BME, Black and Minority Ethnic EDI network support group while actively engaging in the mainstream networks and developing significant international networks, not necessarily certain racial, ethnicity-based network. And then they keeping the low-profile nature of ambidexterity, socially passive, loyal, and yet individually proactive to survive and thrive. And here I wouldn't wish to overgeneralize my research finding, but it is probably probable that East Asian academics' self-accountability and strong belief in meritocracy are still very confusion value laden. And which the confusion values thing can be identified with is revering the existing social order, believing in meritocracy, believing that anyone who survived the rigor of study and exam could be overtly mobile, and a high level of aspiration and attainment, an emphasis on self-cultivation to determine one's proper position in the network of social relationships and to behave properly according to one's position, an emphasis on individual accountability, diligence, thrift, cooperation, and loyalty to one's group and organization. So when both the internationalization and the equality and diversity policies in higher education promote neoliberal normative way of mobilizing social agents, where individuals must plan, produce, and accomplish their professional career development in the ethos and structure of the enterprise form, international East Asian academics' self-defined positions seem to fit in well with this agenda. The obvious point to emphasize the possibility of Confucian neoliberal attributes. That was my provisional conclusion of this research on the positional identities of the East Asian academics. So I would like to raise some points drawn from the case study. The positionality of a stranger does not automatically mean an outlier. However, to be a stranger is naturally a positive relations as defined by Georg Zimmer. But I think for me, it is a positive relation for new knowledge creation. And what is the tipping point for knowledge to become capital? And what is the tipping point for creativity to make innovation happen? I think generating creative ideas is not enough, but you have to bring them to the world, to the society, stressing the breakthrough nature, invoking the Schumpeter's creative destruction can mean that radical innovation. And I'm interested in this role of transnational identity capital in this process. So far, I have presented many questions, and I would like to suggest a new prototype for Homo academicus. I think over the last 30, 40 years, the Homo academicus has been modeled after Homo economicus, as Habermas said, in the neoliberal marketized university. But it is required to amend it now. I think Homo academicus should now be defined as Homo empathicus through nomadic imagination in the age of immobility and the rise of digital platform economy of higher education. So we are all in it together. And I think the time is right to reimagine a means and end goal of internationalization in higher education accordingly. So that's end of my presentation, and I would appreciate your comments and discussion. Thank you.